I don't think
Yeah, well, I mean,
know you.
all right, we are now on YouTube, everyone. So good morning officially to our Wednesday study group that we've decided to name Wednesday Study Group because we have no idea what to name it. Comprised of many people. Everyone is meeting Noel. Noel is our resident Texan who is on the call with us. And so welcome to everybody. Noel, most of the people on this group today are from Sun City. So that is a Sun City in Bluffton, South Carolina. Savannah is on the border of South Carolina. So it's just a step above us. And Bluffton is one of the cities nearest to us. So we have a wonderful Sun City. I believe it's the second biggest Sun City in the country, right? The first is maybe Arizona. I don't know if that's true or not,
Yeah.
but
I don't know.
I don't know.
I thought we were bigger.
Maybe you are bigger. I don't know. You know what? You're better. You're the best one, but I don't know if you're bigger.
We're younger.
The younger, more, better looking. So what we're going to talk today, again, in this class, we choose each week what we're going to talk about in the following weeks. And this week, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Yiddish. Of course, we'll have some Yiddish phrases and add that in, but we'll talk a little bit about the history of Yiddish and where it comes from. But before we start, how many of you grew up with parents or grandparents or somebody in the family who spoke Yiddish fluently and still spoke it growing up? All right, so I may be the only one. So no, you go to the left and you'll see something that says start video. Click on that and that may help you.
Okay, I went outside to take the dog to pee.
There you go.
Right.
I have a funny story.
All right.
Can I take time to
Please,
tell
please
it?
do. No, please tell us your funny story.
Okay. My grandmother spoke only Yiddish, and there was a lady, a Greek lady, who lived a couple streets down, and she would come over and she would bring her Greek cookies. My grandma had her strudel, and they sat there in two different languages, and they understood each other.
Oh, wow.
Mm.
I don't know, and I used to sit there and say, Grandma, y'all are just speaking two different languages. It was just incredible. And they would sit there and have their coffee and their cookies. Why can't the world be like that now?
That would be great. Although I think cookies is the one thing in the world that we all agree we like. But besides that, we're very divided in many ways. But we're coming together.
You
Hopefully
know,
Okay.
I don't think that was that uncommon that our grandparents spoke another language. My grandmother spoke, I thought, only Yiddish until I started studying Spanish in high school, and she started speaking to me in Spanish. So, which was astounding to me. Well, it turned out she worked in restaurants, and it was the only way she could communicate with the helpers in the restaurants in New York. So she had learned Spanish. So,
I love Yiddish.
one never
I just
knows.
love
Very cool.
Okay.
Well, we'll hear more of these stories. And at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about Yiddish words and Yiddish phrases, and we'll do that as much. But we're just going to go over a little bit of the origins of Yiddish, which is very interesting. It's really only been called Yiddish for a short while. It was called Jewish for a long time, kind of like a Jewish language. And there are many people who have many views as to when it was founded. Generally thought in the 9th century in Central Europe, but there was actually two different Yiddishes created, two main Yiddishes. I'm sure there were offshoots of them. And it's really interesting to see that the earlier one, of course, fades away. But the first one is really in Central Europe in the 9th century, and it's kind of based on German. And it is basically from a group of Jews moving there from France and Italy. So whereas many of us think of Yiddish as being more Eastern Europe, the original Europe was spoken in a lot on the Rhine, which is of course the western edge of Germany, close to France. So you had all these Jews moving there who spoke a little bit of French, spoke a little bit of Italian, some were German. And so they mixed this dialect known as Lays into what they would have as their early European, Central European Yiddish. Now, most people don't realize that there are two forms. They have the Eastern Yiddish, because that one, of course, is the one we all know about, but also what some would call the Western Yiddish, but there's, different dialects in each one. The Western Yiddish is in, of course, as I said, Central Europe, West Germany, and it's kind of died off. And a lot of people don't realize that they had their own Yiddish, and we're going to talk a little bit about why that one died off so much more quickly. But that one really died off a lot earlier, but was still probably the first Yiddish, and was one of the probably predominant Yiddish for centuries. Now, how many of you have ever heard the fact that there were two Yiddishes before? I think a lot of people don't realize that. And mostly because we have only really one left. But really, it began as a Jewish language, and we'll talk a little bit about why it was a Jewish language and all that. So with that, we have the Western Europe, or Western Yiddish, that starts in probably the 9th century. We have no proof of that. There's a lot of indirect evidence. There's a lot of thought, but they usually use the language itself to try and determine where this language. It was also called, the Jews were called the Ashkenaz, which of course comes from the book of Genesis, but then of course we all know that's what they became known as, all the European Jews. But these first 9th, 10th century Jews, known as the Ashkenaz, who moved to the Rhineland. And again, this is years, decades, centuries before the mass immigration to the Eastern Europe that we know so much about. So some of the Jews who moved to this area were what you would call Sephardi Jews today. Their people came from Roman areas. They spoke Aramaic. And so this is where a lot of the original Yiddish came from. The German vernacular, a lot of people spoke that, but a lot of people weren't literate. Now we have to remember, even when we're taking languages from other people, that doesn't mean they know how to read and write them. They just know how to, most people just know how to speak a language. They didn't necessarily know how to read or write them. And so what that did for the Jewish population was create a need to form their own alphabet. Since they were both literate in another language or for back. So all they did was simply take the Hebrew alphabet and make that into the alphabet for Yiddish both times, even though there's a lot of difference in the what you call the way the language works. So what they would do is they'd kind of infuse some Hebrew into Yiddish because they didn't have the word in Yiddish yet. The Yiddish, whereas in Hebrew, each letter is only a consonant, and you need the little nikudim, those dots and slashes for vowels. Yiddish kind of added where the consonant could also be a vowel, and that consonants together or words or letters together created their own vowels. And so it's still got Hebrew words. It uses Hebrew letters, but the punctuation is different, and so is the grammar. And so remember, this is all in the Rhine area, Western Germany, North France. So they're speaking this language. It is fairly popular among Jews for a variety of reasons. It becomes obviously more popular among Jews in the 12th century. That's after the Crusades. So after the Crusades, Jews are becoming pushed into more protective enclaves where they need some protection of their own. Also, this language is also unique because it's not distinct to one area. It goes to many areas, whereas in most cases, languages were for a certain area. So as we know, it became known as Jewish because people could speak it in so many areas. Now, I don't know if you spoke Western Europe, how much you could speak to someone speaking Eastern Yiddish. So I don't know if anybody knows, is it like, Spanish and Portuguese, which is really very different, or is it like Spanish in Spain and Spanish in Mexico, which is different, but if you speak Spanish in Mexico, you can get around in Spain. They just can tell that you have a different dialect. So we have no evidence, though, of any Yiddish in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries at all. So there are no writings, there's no books, nothing. So what we have to do is let the authorities or the scholars look at the words and try and figure out where the words came from and all of that, which of course is something beyond those of us who are not skilled in that area. They can look at certain words and say, but what we need to know is Aramaic language, Jews coming from Roman areas, from Mesopotamia, all moving from southern Italy into France and the Rhineland, and that combining German, this became an offshoot of German, whereas when it went into Eastern Europe, it became kind of its own language. And so entirely different language, because not only was it based a little bit on German, but you'd have the Slavic languages and all the other stuff. The earliest Yiddish phrase we have comes from a machzor, a prayer book, obviously, for the high holidays from 1272. So that is the first indication of Yiddish in history. So again, no proof in the 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th centuries at all. It's not till Yiddish has been around 300-400 years, we think, that we have the first. And it's from one phrase in this machzor, which says, "May a good day come to him who carries this prayer book into the synagogue." And that is the first Yiddish phrase we have in any book. And again, the whole book is not Yiddish. Now, when did Yiddish become more popular as a written form? It is very easy to understand this because it's the same thing that happened to everybody else. The big change from Yiddish being more of a smaller, passing books from one to the other was, of course, the printing press. And very soon after the printing press was invented, 1455-ish, everybody started using it. I mean, it's like the next day, people are using it. The Talmud's written in a couple of years, Yiddish has come out. So really, like everything else, the printing press made Yiddish more of a modern language with lots of books because of that. Now, when did the Old Yiddish, where did the Eastern Yiddish start to come in? That is hard to tell, but before we have these Eastern Yiddish, we have another Yiddish, and that is what they would call Old Yiddish, which starts in around the 13th century. That will morph into Eastern Yiddish. Okay, so this is this Old Yiddish, or there's different ways to call it. There's Western Yiddish and Eastern Yiddish. Some call it Modern Yiddish, some call it Middle English Yiddish, but there's a wide range. But the Western Yiddish starts coming in the 13th century. Why? That is when Poland, Ukraine, of course, they had different names at these times, this part of Russia, Eastern Germany, start to invite Jews to come in, welcoming them because of the skills they have. So Jews flock to this area because they're being welcomed, which is unlike the reception they're receiving in other places in Europe. So Jews en masse move there. We still to this day do not know where all of those Eastern European Jews come from. There's far too many to prove they come from any place. Some would say from Italy, some would say some moved from this Western Europe, some would say from Mesopotamia, some would say from Spain. I mean, there's a wide range of thought. Some would just say they had lots and lots of babies. That's why they had so many. Some would say they are Khazars, which of course is the 13th tribe, this old ancient warrior groups, which of course, it's a warrior group of Jews, which of course that's where I descend from. So 13th century, we have the competing Yiddish. The printing press really gives a lot of prominence to Yiddish now, because by the 16th century, you have Yiddish has become very prominent in both Western Europe and Eastern Europe. The printing press has given opportunities for people to write in this work and have it mass produced cheaply. So what comes of this? Well, not only are there more books for men, but there's more books for women, and a women's Yiddish develops because women were not necessarily allowed to be literate in Hebrew, but they were allowed to be literate in Yiddish. Of course, they came up with their Technot, their own Yiddish language for women. We have a lot of, there's an entire history of that. As men were reading more religious works, women would read more secular works or kind of stories. But women in the Jewish world throughout this time period were much, much more literate than men in the non-Jewish world. And it's not till the Enlightenment that women are going to be starting to start reading. And in the Jewish world, they're reading the whole time. So women had their own language, although it was a Yiddish, but they had their own, not language, their own prose, their own poetry, their own literature. Literature would be better. So these two Yiddishes are moving along. Obviously, they become prominent for different reasons depending on the age. One of the reasons that it's also that Jews are literate and others are not. As time went on in both of these places, the Crusades, Jews were moved into their own little areas. In Western Europe, they became known as mostly ghettos, in Eastern Europe, ghettos, and of course, shtetls. But they're moved, and so they need this protective language so they can speak to each other without having outside interference. And so it probably wasn't originally created as a secret language, but it became a secret language because of this. And I don't think this is new to any of us, but it probably wasn't started that way in either place, because in many places Jews were welcome. In the 9th, 10th centuries, early 11th century, Jews were welcome in Central Western Europe. 13th and 14th centuries, they were welcome in Eastern Europe. And it's not till later that these persecutions, one of the theories is once Jews are invited in after a century or 2 centuries, the non-Jews have learned all of the skills the Jews have brought with them. And so they're no longer needed. And that's one of the thoughts. The other, of course, is persecution. In this case, the Crusades, and then later there'll be other things, of course, we know go on in other places. So Yiddish in the Western dialect, the Western Yiddish starts to dissipate. Now, why do we lose Western Yiddish? And again, it has to do with the outside world. The Western Jewish world is part of the Enlightenment. In the Jewish world, it's called the Haskalah. That is this new educational opportunity that starts in the 18th century and really gains traction even more in the 19th century. What is this new movement? Jews are welcome into the secular world. They're welcome to study at universities. Thank you, Napoleon. They're welcome to go into different fields. They're welcome to leave the ghettos as long as they pledge allegiance to the country or state. And when this happens, the Western Jews, although they probably knew this before, but the Western Yiddish-speaking Jews realized that the non-Jews looked at this Yiddish as a scary, secret, corrupt language. Even though it was based on German, the same thing in the Yiddish world, in the Eastern Yiddish world. Think about, you're using German words that haven't been used for centuries, because you get isolated with a certain type of German words in Yiddish, but you are in a different path. And so you're Yiddish German is very different than the current Yiddish German. Your Yiddish French words are very different. So it's a very different path. And so they were suspected, obviously, was considered a low-class language. We'll see the same thing happen to Eastern Europe, but not yet. And so it died off pretty much, almost completely. I mean, there's still remnants, but it never had the age of, Yiddish theater, the age of Yiddish newspapers that we're going to see in the other world. Because really Yiddish takes off as a literary form in the 19th century. And because the Western Yiddish is already starting to disappear, they never have this enlightenment of Yiddish that we're going to see in 18th century and Eastern. Now in Eastern Europe, in the Eastern Yiddish, they do not get the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment stops at the border of Poland and East Germany. Those are much more harsher lives. They don't have democracy left yet. They're going to stay in their own world. Jews are staying in the shtetls. Jews are staying in the ghettos, whereas in the Western Yiddish groups, they're leaving. So there's a very big break. One Yiddish group becomes part of the modern world. The other Yiddish group does not. But even though they're not part of the modern world, they start to get this idea of education, of literature, of plays, of newspapers. And so this entire body of Yiddish culture starts to be created in the Eastern Europe. Whereas the Haskalah and those who were what we call maskil in the Western world leave. So in Eastern Europe, they go in completely different directions. Eastern Europe becomes more cohesive. They're more ostracized. In Western Europe, they become less cohesive and more becoming part of the culture. So in this ostracized world, Yiddish becomes very prominent. And of course, this is where we get Yiddish theater, Yiddish cinema. This is all in the mid to late 19th century, first in Eastern Europe, but by the late 19th century, we all know that it comes to America. Yiddish literature in America comes very prominent at it overlaps with Eastern Europe for a very good portion of time, maybe 50 years. So whereas in Eastern Europe, you'll have Yiddish theater, in America, you'll have Yiddish theater. You'll have Yiddish literature and poetry and newspapers in both Eastern Europe and America for like 40, 50 years until, of course, the Holocaust. And so what we see is this very great prominence, which is really quite incredible, that it's so much, it becomes so much a part of the world that when the Soviet Union takes over, Yiddish becomes part of the language of the Soviet Union for a short time. It's considered part of an official language. And that's how prominent it was. So until 1938, it was considered one of the languages of the Soviet Union in certain areas. And a lot of people don't realize that. It wasn't until later that when Stalin started to clamp down, but it was very prominent. In America, of course, it becomes very prominent as people move. But as with Western Yiddish, it starts to dissipate for the exact same reason. Because after they're in America for a while, what do they want for their children? They want them to be anglicized, secularized. And so Yiddish dies, not as quickly as we might think. I mean, it's still pretty prominent until the 1930s, but certainly by the end of World War II, Jews have fought in the war, they feel more American, but we all know the story as to why Yiddish disappeared in Europe. And Europe obviously disappeared because of the Holocaust, and America disappeared because we became assimilated or acculturated. Now, in Israel, follows a lot of the same patterns, but in a different way. Israel was a new area, you got to remember, in the 19th and 20th century. And so there were a lot of debates as to what language they would speak in Israel. And really, a lot of people wanted it to be Yiddish because they already spoke Yiddish. So obviously it was a little easier if you already spoke the language. But as time went on, and as Jews became more ostracized and persecuted, and as Israel became a country and you had an influx of Sephardic Jews that would eventually become almost 50% and then over 50%, and they didn't speak any Yiddish at all, Yiddish ceased to be the language of Israel officially. I think it was official language for a while, but it's no longer anymore. And we would think that Yiddish would have died. I mean, it seems like it's dead. But as we know, it didn't die. Why didn't it die? Because in one way, well, two reasons. One, the ultra-Orthodox and modern scholarship. In the ultra-Orthodox world, Yiddish remains very prominent. There's probably 1.5 million Jews who speak Yiddish, maybe 2 million, and most of them are in these ultra-Orthodox sects, women and men. Now, why do they speak Yiddish in this grouping?
You talking about the religious, the observed, the like Chabad in them, they don't speak in Hebrew because they feel it's only for praying. So
Right.
they speak in Yiddish in their homes.
So in some places, Hebrew is considered more of a holy language or a language of study, not necessary for modern vernacular. It's also a way to honestly repress people. And that's what it's used as, unfortunately, in some of these groups. Well, how can a language be used to repress people? Well, think if you're a Jew in New York, or especially in places like B'nai B'rak in Israel, and you want to leave your group, why can't you leave? Because you don't speak English and you don't speak Hebrew. So you can't leave in New York, you don't speak the language, and you don't speak the language in Israel. So you are very stuck. Especially with women, and I hate to be negative, but it is very difficult for women if you have children at a very young age. To escape that life is very difficult because you don't speak the language. If you leave your children behind. And again, there are a lot of organizations in Israel and some in America that help to bring them in. But it's really difficult when you don't have skills. It's difficult for men. For women, it's even more difficult. But Yiddish survives. It also became very much an academic language in the last 30 years. So you see it being taught in schools, not really Western Yiddish, but Eastern Yiddish is something that becomes taught in schools. And so you'll see it at universities that you can take Yiddish now, which is really interesting. That only started maybe, I'm guessing 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I think we became Americanized enough that we didn't feel like learning Yiddish was going to make us less American anymore. Now, as for the numbers, and again, these are all estimated, before World War II, there were about 11 to 13 million people who spoke Yiddish. That would be about the population of Jews in the world today. 85% of Jews who died in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers. So that tells you alone what happened to Yiddish in Eastern Europe. So there's now 2+ million Jews, they think, who speak Eastern Yiddish, some in Israel, some in the United States, some still in Ukraine, some in a small group of them. There was a Russian province that was set aside for Jews. It's right next to China, and there's still even Jews there who speak a little bit of Yiddish. So it still exists in some places, but by the most part, it is spoken by these ultra-Orthodox sects. Not all of them speak Yiddish. Chabad, for instance, although has Yiddish, but they also speak English because they're more of an outgoing. Now, interestingly enough, some Yiddish was spoken not in just these areas of France and of Germany, but it went all the way up to Denmark, Sweden. A lot of these places, Jews were speaking Yiddish, which is hard to believe. Has anybody seen the movie A Mighty Wind?
Yeah.
It's a great movie. Christopher Guest
Yes. Yeah.
wrote it with, what's his name? What's the Jewish? He may be Jewish too. What's his name? He was from Canada. He's been in all those movies. He's got the dark eyebrows. Eugene Levy.
Oh,
Eugene Levy. So, they write the script and then you kind of, as you're doing the movie, you kind of improvise. Well, Yiddish is now a legal language in Sweden. It's one of the official languages of Sweden because they have a history of Yiddish being spoken. And in this movie, there's a character named Lars Ulfen. I don't know if you remember the movie, played by Ed Begley Jr., who's like this 6'4" blonde guy. He was on, what was the doctor show in the early 80s?
St. Elsewhere. Yeah.
And so he's speaking Yiddish with this very American Swedish accent. It is hilarious. So if you get to watch that movie, you think it's so funny to see this guy descended from Swedes who was born in Sweden speaking Yiddish, but the truth is they were speaking Yiddish in Sweden. Now, Stuart asked why Hebrew became the world language, and I mean that's pretty much because of Israel. Once Israel decided Hebrew was going to be the national language, it filtered out to the rest of the world. That's why we read and speak Sephardic Hebrew, because that was the Hebrew chosen for Israel. Yiddish in Israel was considered this, especially after the Holocaust, the language of the people who died, of people who, were powerless, I guess is the best word. And
Absolutely.
so, and then we'll go first. Who just said actually? I couldn't tell.
I did.
Okay, was that, okay, Stuart.
Yeah. My question was really the reverse, thinking early on.
Oh, sorry, it is.
The educated folks spoke Hebrew. Why is it that when we moved essentially, I understand why the movement from France to Germany, Mainz, for example, was one of the major
Yes.
learning centers. So that part is clear. But what made it such that even though we needed a coded language for trade and whatnot, what made us turn to a relatively new language of Yiddish rather than just keep Hebrew as the language of the Jews, the translatable language?
It's a really good question. We don't know for sure, but we believe Hebrew stopped being a spoken language sometime around the destruction of the Second Temple, before or after. So the language Jews were speaking in the first century was probably Aramaic. We still don't know for sure, but it was probably some form of Aramaic, Roman, Greek, all mixed in. Hebrew at that point had already begun to be a language of prayer and study. And so by the 9th century, that's what it already is in most places. I don't know if any place they were speaking Hebrew in the vernacular in the 9th century. So they were speaking the language of these different countries. And as they went to areas where they wanted to get together or where they were persecuted, that's one of the reasons Yiddish became a language. Flossie.
Yeah. When Jeff and I were in Israel, right after the 7-day war, we went to a Ramadan stadium. And as we're going to our seat, there was a singer singing in Yiddish. And there was such booing.
Really?
Yes. Remember just screaming. So I'm so naive. I said to Jeff, I don't think her voice is that bad. I couldn't imagine why they were doing that. And we asked someone nearby, what's going on? That's Yiddish. That's the past.
Yeah.
We don't want this.
And
We
Yiddish
speak
represented
Hebrew.
a weakness because what happened in Europe. And this is in the 60s in Israel.
Right.
So they're
Right around after the war.
right after the war. So they were pretty much full of themselves also at the time, very patriotic. And that was one of the reactions.
It took us back, so we were so shocked.
And again, it's still that way a little bit, not as bad. Obviously, in the 60s and 50s, it was almost forbidden. Now, could you speak Yiddish? Obviously you could, because a lot of people only spoke Yiddish. So for the older people, but anybody younger, they were speaking Hebrew. Today, it's not as much so in Israel because it's been around for a long time, but a lot of times I think it's thought of as an ultra Orthodox language or the language of the past, as you said. Larry, I'm sorry, sorry, Flossie, and then go back to Larry.
Where you're saying with it coming, I'm sorry, are we on?
Yeah, you're on.
Sorry. They just made Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And it was very accepted. Now, was that as far as because it's truly coming back in vogue?
It is.
It is coming back in vogue a little bit, not as much. It's become a very popular, less so than it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, academic language. And I think think about the stories of the shtetl nowadays, they have been romanticized. Certainly Fiddler on the Roof did a lot for this. So Yiddish, especially in America, does not have the same taint as it does in Israel. In Israel, it's certainly not as bad as it was because, again, they're a formidable modern country now. They're not worried about looking like. So it's making a comeback. It still is, but it's still not becoming a spoken language in the vernacular for most people, unless you're in the ultra-Orthodox sect. And in some places a little here and there. But it is not like Hebrew, which was a completely dead language and came back as a spoken language. Yiddish has made a comeback, but it's really only spoken in the day-to-day in those sects.
Ironically, it's even being taught now in Polish universities.
Yeah, it is. That's right. Yeah, and a lot of these old countries have, want to establish educational centers, and Jews are known as being very educated, and they're realizing the commitment Jews to have to them. There's not enough Jews in these areas to be a threat anymore, so that's what they're trying to do. Larry.
No Jews in the class, Rabbi, but
yeah.
A Yiddish class, 0 Jews.
Right. When I went to Poland with my cousin, he had already done all of the camps and that, so I did a little bit of that. But then we went on vacation in Poland to the Gdansk region, which is where a lot of the Poles go for vacation. So we're the only Jews. I mean, people kept coming up to us asking if we were Jews because we were the only short, dark-haired people. Over and over, people come up to us because that's what they thought Jews were, short, black-haired people. And just coincidentally, we looked Jewish. They were nice, super nice about it. But I saw they were having Yiddish theater there. They were having Yiddish classes there. But in the Gdansk region, there are no Jews there at all. It's all these tall German ancestry people and a lot of vacationers. So it was pretty interesting.
Yeah, amazing.
I'm sorry, Larry, you've been waiting. I apologize.
No problem. I think there were also 2 other events that also led to the revival, if you want to call it that, of Yiddish. One was the establishment of the Yiddish Literacy Center in Massachusetts, Springfield, Massachusetts, I think it is. And it just turned out that in the Bronx, New York, which happened to be, I'm from Brooklyn and I never realized it, but the Bronx was kind of like the literary cultural center of Judaism and of Yiddishkeit, and many of those things. They had co-ops there that they called the coops, and many of those coops were very, very large apartment buildings that were, people that were streaming out of the Lower East Side. They were garment workers and things like this. And they had a tremendously vibrant intellectual community there with many, many Yiddish writers and authors, playwrights, and so forth, artists and so forth. And when those coops were then being taken over and they lost some money on them and they basically had to give up in bankruptcy, the libraries of the coops were being devastated. And they had, in each of the buildings, they had these gigantic libraries of Yiddish information. And that became the foundation for the Yiddish Literacy Center. That whole collection, which is enormous. And then they started collecting, all kinds of things, films and diaries and everything else. The second thing I think that had a major impact was when Isaac Bashevis Singer won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And I think that finally created kind of a legitimacy that the Yiddish language in writing, was something substantial and something to be looked at. So I think both of those events kind of gave an impetus to the revival, if you call it a revival, of Yiddishness in the United States, at least.
Yeah, that's really, and that's, again, as I knew you were going to talk about, is an incredible place. One of my professors was very much part of that. And it's, just very rich. But again, we think of Yiddish, this Yiddish culture of going back 1,000 years, it does. But that literature, the culture of that is really more from the 19th century. So they're dealing with a lot of issues we're very familiar with. When you talk about, Al Peretz and Isaac Bashevis Singer, and of course, Tevye. It's really incredible stuff. And it really, I think, is very, I think those are definitely the reasons. And again, we appreciate it now also because we have this, view of, this beautiful view of the shtetl life and how wonderful it was, which isn't, true. But again, whenever we look back in time, we think more of the wonderful things as opposed to the difficult ones. So you think about Shalom, I don't know if you've ever Mendel Mocher Sforim, who was kind of considered, I think, the father of modern Yiddish or Yiddish literature. He's kind of one of the first of these great poets from the 19th century. And of course, there are others, but the most famous today would probably be Shalom Aleichem, which of course we all know from Fiddler on the Roof, and Al Peretz. Those are probably the two most famous, along with Isaac Bashevis Singer, who also wrote in Yiddish almost exclusively, I believe. Any thoughts or questions before we continue? And we'll go into some Yiddish phrases and Yiddish words. But it's a really, again, it served its purpose for about 1,000 years. It kept us literate, kept us connected, and today it continues to keep us connected more in a historical sense. But the idea that Jews have been literate and had to remain literate for a long time is one of the reasons why we had to have this language when nobody else had one. So it's a really incredible, I wish I spoke it. I know if you speak German, you can at least speak it. And, as I said, my cousin Ron doesn't know Hebrew, but he remembers Hebrew letters from his bar mitzvah. And he speaks German. So he can speak a little bit and understand a little bit of Yiddish, whereas others, like me, cannot, because it's a really different language, although there's some Hebrew. Now, what are some of the great curses? And if you know of any, let me know. But let me go through a couple. I found some. I've known some through the years, but I found some other good ones. There's very vicious. May you get passage out of the old village safely, and when you settle, may you fall into the outhouse just as a regiment of Ukrainians is finishing a prune stew and 12 barrels of beer. That was a great one. They kind of add them together too. May you turn into a centipede with ingrown toenails. May onions grow in your navel, and may you lie in the earth and bake bagels. The second part I know is very familiar, but I didn't know about the first part about the ingrown toenails for centipedes, which is May your two sons grow up happy and strong, and may they become a doctor and a lawyer, and may each marry a wonderful woman and have wealth. And may they each have many children, and may they name all of them after you.
Yeah.
So I like. There was another one about, I remember, may you get married 5 times so that you'll have 5 mother-in-laws, something like that. But some of them are very, very brutal. I mean, if you go through them, I don't feel comfortable saying all of them online. But, I won't say the worst ones, but he should marry the daughter of the angel of death. He should get so sick as to cough up his mother's milk. Yeah. He let him suffer and remember. Some of them leeches should drink him dry. he should grow a wooden tongue. Why bother getting up alive? I should outlive him long enough so I can bury him. God should bless him with 3 people. 1 should grab him, the 2nd should stab him, and the 3rd should hide him. So these are really 10 ships of gold should be his, and money should only make him sick. He should have a large store, and whatever people ask for, he shouldn't have, and whatever he does have shouldn't be requested. This one I found often. 100 houses shall he have, in every house 100 rooms, in every room 20 beds, and a delirious fever should drive him from bed to bed. This one I knew. All his feet should fall out except for one, so he should always have a toothache. God should bestow with him everything his heart desires, but should be a quadriplegic and not be able to use his tongue.
Oh.
He should be transformed into a chandelier to hang by day and burn by night. So I even found a couple modern ones, which I thought were kind of neat. May your mother get you a fun new app that allows her to reach you more easily. And may you learn it also has a tracking device and just knows what you're up to, then repeats in her voice, "You're breaking my heart." May the men in your family be blessed with luxurious hair that remains thick and curly well into their 80s. And may you be the only one to inherit great Zadie Yosel's recessive gene for male pattern baldness, which kicks in the day after your bar mitzvah. May you be approaching your 16th birthday, and maybe you've been promised your own car, and may you have your heart set on that red 2012 Mazda Speed Protege that revs to 170 miles on Craigslist, and may your parents proudly hand you keys to a 2002 beige Chrysler station wagon. May you be texting on a Jewish social networking site and get the following message from Shloma 2, DYHM. Think it means, do you heart me? And may you learn then Shloma 2 is your mother, and DYHM stands for do your homework, Mamala. May you be a hot new Glad kosher chef, and may the Food Network challenge you to a televised throwdown showdown, and may Irishman Bobby Flay beat you in front of millions with his gribbiness. Which I don't know what it is. This is my favorite one. May it be Christmas Day, and while your Gentile friends are eating ham surrounded by red and green lights and holy bows, sitting around a gazunta tree, opening presents, may the only Glad kosher Chinese restaurant within 50 miles be closed for renovations. That's a modern one.
As is the movie next to it.
Yeah, right. That's right.
Yes. All right. Does anybody have Yiddish words or phrases or curses? Jane, and then Flossie.
Mute me.
You are unmuted.
Oh, okay. My grandmother lived with us for 15 years of my life. And she used to say, when she used to get frustrated with us or tired of what we would say, "Geh verdrehte dein Kopf and meines ist meine." Go make yourself crazy and think you're doing it to me. Which I thought was good. But it's funny that you say that Yiddish and German are so much alike. I had taken German in high school, and the teacher said, "How do you say open the window?" Because it was very hot. So of course I raised my hand and I said, "Vermachte Winde," not knowing that my grandmother spoke English and not Yiddish.
And how close was that to the actual German?
I don't know. In German and Yiddish,
close,
fenster is window.
Right. Yeah. Well, I have a German.
They're written down that you could easily send them to us, at least some of them, or is
Yeah, I'll send the whole thing.
that's very cute to have a list of those.
You know, I have a German Yiddish story, which I hope I've never haven't told you. But when Eileen and I were in Sweden many years ago, there's a copper mine, which is the oldest in the world, and continuous mining for for the millennium. And we wanted to take a tour. Unfortunately, the train was a little late and we got there and there were no more English tours that day. But the next tour was a German tour. And I said to Eileen, well, look, I speak, enough Yiddish. And at that time, there's a long time ago, at that time I did. So we took the German tour of the mine. And I couldn't translate a word. It was terrible.
Yeah.
So there's sometimes not, so sometimes, German and Yiddish are not, not
Oh yeah, a lot of times they're not.
That's the message I'm giving.
Yeah, and plus, if you read something, it's easier to translate than if you're saying it, because you can sit there and look at the roots. Flossie.
We have friends called Bob and Sue Wiener who have moved from here, and they gave us a gift.
Oh, I didn't know them. Yeah, I did know them. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Yiddish with Dick and Jane.
Oh,
and
that is awesome.
It is wonderful to have, but a cute sentence to tell you on the back. It says, "Oy vey, a primer like no other, a better language than Yiddish." And I'm saying it for this reason: to express those shades of feeling and nuances of meaning that plain old boring English just can't deliver. And it has the story of them with Yiddish mixed.
That's awesome.
Very cute, very cute.
All right, Stuart.
I had a couple of observations. One, even watching the news these days, the amount of Yiddish that has crept into the English language is so tremendously high. You see this, newscaster with the Midwestern American accent, all of a sudden saying that so and so, this congressman thinks he's such a chacham.
Yeah.
Karen and I constantly, get a kick out of that one.
I think it's great.
I made a little list, and I'm curious how many people have heard, some of the words or know what some of the words on the list are. These are things that I heard in my family, in my home all the time, often not used in their original sense, but not so nicely. But if we can, I'd like to start off with the foods that are, we had common. One was pacha.
That's a food.
Which is a gel made out of the hooves of cattle, and you put in eggs and about 5 times as much garlic as you ought to put in. Eggs, garlic, onion, and garlic, and cow's feet and garlic.
Actually,
that was the only thing I would not eat as a child. I just,
Yeah, I looked at it.
Never even heard of
I'm
it.
sure Lila's is good.
Lila, did you eat that as well?
No, I didn't. But I remember one curse from my days in Shalom Aleichem school where I went.
Oh, you went to Shalom Aleichem school. Really? Nice.
I even went to Shalom Aleichem High School.
Really?
In New York, but I don't remember an awful lot. But I have one Jewish curse word, curse. Zelfs wachsen wie Zibbele, mit den Köppen dreht and the Fies in the hair. In other words, did you all get it?
No. I did not.
You should grow like an onion with your head in the ground and your feet up in the air. It's
That's
just
awesome.
I don't know when you'd use it, but
I think that one was probably used a lot 100 years ago.
Been 100 years ago. That was the first one on my list.
Yeah.
you know that one?
What? Not the book. I wrote put together a list, and that was the first curse on my list.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How about that?
No, I take that back. The first one on my list was Judy's. Verdrezen Dynagenum Cup. Which literally, I guess, means spin your own eyes around in your head.
Look, it's a cup and kitchen.
Does anybody remember a food? My father used to love shav. It was like sorrel
Yeah.
wheat.
Oh,
You
I,
eat
yeah,
that? Ugh, it was so sour and horrible.
I eat that all the time. I love that.
You
Hmm.
did well, and he used
I'm-
to love the pacha, and he used to eat the jelly out of the gefilte fish
I've
can.
never heard of
We'd be
any
like,
of that.
Yeah, of course. You put that on rye bread like schmaltz.
yeah.
Ugh.
I
I
was
don't
going to
even know
tell you
what.
real quickly two very short things about Yiddish and how universal it was. My cousin was married to a man from Hungary, and his parents used to come to visit because they stayed in Budapest, and they didn't speak English, but they spoke Yiddish. So when we would go to visit, when they were visiting, my parents and my aunt and uncle, and they had a great time because they could all speak, and he just loved coming because he could talk. But the funny one was Jeff's parents were world travelers before it was popular to travel, when people didn't travel. And wherever they went, they'd find shopkeepers in Europe, of course, that spoke Yiddish because many were Jewish. And so Jerry was sought after by her friends because they would want to buy something, and they'd come to find her and say, Jerry, please come, talk to the shopkeeper, haggle for us, because she was the only one of her group that could speak Yiddish. So, but my mother and her sisters spoke Yiddish solely with my grandmother and with us till I was in college, and my grandmother died. And my grandmother, and all four of my grandparents could read and write English, and they all had businesses, but they just loved, and they all, as soon as we knew they would talk about the Shana Madels, we would know they were talking about us, but we couldn't understand, and they didn't want us to understand. So it's kind of
Schade
funny.
Kinder.
Exactly.
Stuart knew
Hey,
my
There
father,
was,
and
a
you
clip?
never heard him curse, I'm sure, but every once in a while, it's nothing. It's just so different. He would, when he'd get angry at somebody, usually in the family, he would go say, Kishmi and Tuchis,
Mhm.
but he didn't stop there. He'd go Kishmi and Tuchis in Macy's window. I don't know why, but he just always added that. It was
So everyone could see.
I guess.
Here's a Shav story for you. Actually, it's a Shav borscht story. I used to work as a waiter in the Catskills in a hotel owned by my uncle, which is relevant in this case. When we served Shav or borscht for lunch, which was on the menu every day, and we hated serving borscht because you couldn't keep it in the bowl as you were walking, but we had sour cream in it so that if any of what was in the kitchen the day before was still there, of course it was refrigerated overnight, but someone on the staff had to taste it. Our chef, who happened to be black in a kosher restaurant, made it, but there was no way he was going to taste it. He hated it. So because I was a member of the family, I was designated to be the official taster, and every day I had to eat a little bit of borscht and a little bit of shav, which I could not stand at the beginning of the season. By the end of the season, and to this day, I look forward to it and love both foods.
I don't like. I've had borscht. I don't like it. I've never heard of the other one. But let's
Shav
keep.
in English is sour grass soup.
Yeah.
Yeah. Excuse me. I don't think I like that. But we'll never know. You never know. I mean, a lot of the Jewish foods, non-Jews don't. Who to think that somebody who's as picky as me would like gefilte fish and whitefish salad? But I love them.
Yeah. Actually, shav is early Thai food.
Okay, well then maybe I'll like it. But I wanted to conclude with going over a few words that have kind of become part of the vernacular, some in English and some in the Jewish world, where people say who grew up without any Yiddishkeit might have heard these. And a couple of them, these are just very prominent ones. Altercocker, obviously. Bubkis. Feh. Ganef a little bit less, but certainly there a little bit. Kishka. And I'm thinking about me because, again, I didn't grow up with Yiddishkeit. Macher, of course, Megillah, that's used all the time. Mamzer. It's a Pisher. Plots. Putz. Putz is used by everybody. Schlump. Shlemiel and Schlemazel. Think about Laverne and Shirley. I don't always have trouble
Okay.
differentiating one's useless and one is cursed, but I guess they can overlap. A Shonda, of course, used all the time. A Schmendrick, a Schnorrer. Trying to get ones that are not really, and so Tuchus, of course, is very much. So those are just a couple that if you hear them, Nachas would be another one. I forgot to mention that one.
About Schmegegi.
Schmegegi, that's on here too.
Schlemiel and Schlemazel, I've heard described as a Schlemiel is somebody who spills soup, and Schlemazel is the person the soup gets spilled on.
Yeah, that could be that.
Yeah.
And that
another one that has really come in very strongly in an interesting way is rabbi and shomer, both. But rabbi in New York City, the fire department, the police department, which are very Irish dominated, in both cases, the term rabbi is used for your mentor. Mentor.
Yeah, you're your hook. Right, you're right.
Yeah, it's not just in New York. You find it in a lot of professional situations. He's my rabbi, and it can also, it sometimes gets extended to not only mentor but protector. If you screw up, your rabbi will, protect you.
And one thing we didn't talk about was the Fovitz, the Yiddish newspaper, which I guess is still published, but it's in English now. But it was funny because my grandmother made the best chocolate cake, but none of her 4 daughters got the recipe before she died. So for years, we've been trying to find it. So my cousin found an envelope with all recipes from the Fovitz. Of course, it was all written in Yiddish. And but recently, the Chabad rabbi here, who is fluent and reads and writes, sat down and actually translated them, and we found a chocolate cake recipe, but not the icing. But they loved that. I mean, that was their real tie together. I think the Fovitz and the Bindle briefs. About that, Rabbi. The letters those were kind of letters to the forlorn. There's books of them. They were letters. They were sort of like the modern love column in the New York Times
like
today.
Dear Abby.
No. You just watch the movie Modern Love, and then you can read those columns every day. The New York Times, you'll get it.
It also
like the columns. Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Okay.
It also had serialized novelettes that would run on a daily or weekly basis over very long periods of time. I guess so did the forerunner of soap operas.
Yeah.
And there still are some Yiddish.
And there's a competing paper also called The Day. They're Tug.
The Tug. That was more left wing. The Fovitz was a socialist paper. The Tug, which my grandfather liked, was the socialist labor paper. And so my grandmother read the Fovitz and my grandfather read the Tug. So
I think some of them are still published in Yiddish in small numbers here and there. So there are still some Yiddish newspapers around. I think the Ford may even still publish theirs in Yiddish as well, but I'm not sure. I think they do as a Yiddish version. All right.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for joining us. This was as always Yiddish. Thank you, because obviously you guys are much more experienced. I can look up the history stuff, but I have not a little bit now because I've been a rabbi. But growing up, I don't even think I'd ever heard of rye bread. So it's really nice to get that kind of
anyway.
What?
You managed to grow up without it.
I know, and I stayed Jewish. Who knew that? We didn't have rye bread where I grew up.
Where did you grow?
I'm from South Texas. I'm sure some of the people who came from Eastern Europe, their passed it down. But my grandfather and grandmother were born in America, so I was already several generations in. So we didn't have that Yiddishkeit on the side that was living in my hometown. So I still prefer pastrami on white with mayonnaise. Although I probably these days like sourdough better, and I can eat rye bread. Rye bread's okay, but mustard unless it's a honey mustard dressing, I just can't stand plain mustard. I don't know why. So I'm very much a very partial mayonnaise person, which is very disgusting to a lot of Jews. I couldn't date a lot of women because of that. So what, you eat pastrami on white? But what we're going to do now, unfortunately, mayonnaise is much less healthy than mustard, so that's probably why I like it. Much less. So for next week, we had talked about doing Jewish women of the Bible. I'll make sure that's okay. I may do that in 2 sessions. I may do probably one prominent women and then some who are a little less well-known, kind of a mixture. Or we can just do it in one, or is there something else we want to do? We'd also talked about, the other one we talked about was synagogue design.
Next week is inauguration
It's the
day. That may be
inauguration.
going
So we'll
on in the
skip it
morning.
next
I
week?
thought
Right.
we had decided maybe
That's
not.
right, no class, sorry.
I thought we talked about not meeting.
Yeah, we're not meeting, you're right. So the week after.
Rabbi,
Uh-huh.
am I on? Rabbi, the inauguration, I thought was 12 o'clock. We'd be finished.
I'm
Well-
okay with whatever you guys want to do.
Okay.
I'm going to take a pass next week.
Okay.
So am I. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah,
Oh,
a
yeah,
lot of stuff going on that day.
yeah.
Let's
So
hope today too.
A slight aside,
Let's
just
hope not.
we'll do
Yeah.
Jewish women in the Bible the week after, which will be January 27th,
Okay.
not next week, the week after.
the week after.
Right. Quick question. Did anybody actually get an appointment for a vaccination?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Jeff.
I do. I did. Yeah.
You got him, here we
You
go.
got an actual appointment date?
Yes.
Yeah, my
Tomorrow?
sister got one. Yeah. All my friends got them. Mhm.
Tell them where to go because you guys went to a different place than I think
Well,
Stuart.
no, Jeff told me where to go, and in a nice way. And, it worked out fine. So
It's
Jeff, keep doing it.
Oh,
There's an email address in Tom Davis's letter, an email address, and that you just fill out the email. You send them your name, date of birth, your
Yeah.
address, and your phone number. Everybody has to have a separate email, and they'll send you back the information.
How long did you have to wait for your appointment?
I mean, I just did it all yesterday, within a couple hours.
Yeah, I did it. I called. They took information from me at about 3:30, and at 7:30, 8 o'clock, I got an email from CDC, filled out the form, and got an appointment for tomorrow. And I could have gotten one for
Oh,
today.
at the
Unbelievable. We have heard back from nobody yet.
Just use that email.
Call them
Use
again.
that email. You'll get the form back within an hour or two.
No,
We put in the email Monday morning and haven't gotten it back yet.
no, we
So
haven't.
I don't know what there is in the process.
Is it a form?
There's something funny in the way they process, I guess.
Yeah.
Judy, I asked you, how do I get on for Hadassah today? I called you.
I sent the link yesterday.
Link
I
yesterday.
didn't see
Yeah,
it.
you got it.
Okay, then you
Is
saw
it
it on here.
Judy
Okay.
or anybody, is it a form that you get back, or is it simply that you give them the 4 pieces of information?
Did we get it
You
back?
give them the
Appointment?
information, and then they send you back the form to fill out. You send that back,
A lot of
and
people
then they-
saying Judy and
and then
others
you
saying they got
select
the
where you're
appointment.
gonna go and what time.
Oh, okay, 'cause we had
It looks
sent-
like Coastal has more time. I'm going to Okatee to the new center here by the Cracker Barrel.
Yeah, see, I couldn't get into Okatee, but I got into,
Yeah,
and what they ask for basically is they want to know if you've had allergic reactions, are there things you're allergic to? Do you have any, serious medical conditions? And it takes a good 5-10 minutes. It's a kind of a pain in the neck form, but
Well, hopefully you guys will all get it soon, hopefully the next week or two.
yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Okay,
Stay
Rabbi, I have a
safe.
quick question for you
Rabbi,
also.
see you this afternoon.
I'll see you at 2 o'clock.
Rabbi,
Don't forget.
2 o'clock.
Okay.
Bye.
Rabbi, quick question.
Yeah, Stuart, what's up?
This is not on any of these topics. Do you remember a few years back, there was a lot of publicity about a woman who was a very well-known and accepted Torah scholar in Israel, and I can't for the life of me remember her name.
Give me, yes, 1 second. I know who you're talking about. Nahama Leibowitz.
Yes, thank you very much.
All right. A real pleasure as always. Everyone, please be
You're
safe
right.
next Wednesday. I think everything will be fine, but you can never be too careful. We'll be watching on TV and hopefully everything will go smoothly with all the warnings we're seeing. But again, everybody stay safe and good luck. I hope you're all able to get the injection on the inoculation very soon. If there's anything you need from us, let us know. And hopefully I'll be able to join you in the following months. So just stay safe, everybody.
You too.
See you later, guys. And for some of